Hi, welcome to the Satellite Data for Environmental Justice session. I am Xiao. I'm an associate professor from the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. And we have a panel of 5 very exciting talks. And they're between 5 to 10 minutes, and we are going to have a timer. So when you come up here and speak, please pay attention to the timer. And for this to come up. Yes. So our first talk is by Tess from the George Washington University.
We're holding on a second, but while we do that, anyways, yes, thank you for the introduction. My name is Tess. I'm a postdoc at GW, working with Susan Annenberg and several others on this project. We're listed on the screen and we'll begin. So this project is looking at how different PM2.5 data sets alter our identification of disadvantaged communities. And there's a lot of work in this community that's characterized the differential exposure of racial, ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups, educational attainment, and that sort of thing to air pollution. And so that was really the motivation for this work. And so I'm not going to really go into detail on a lot of that work, but there's a lot of folks who are here, Chris Tessum and others who have done some really great work showing that different exposure. But the image that's popping up now is really the motivation for this particular work. And it's showing a couple of the tools that people use to show spatially areas across the US that are disadvantaged due to air pollution. In this particular case, we're focused on PM2.5. There's been other work from our group focused on NO2. But on the top left is the EPA's EJ screen tool. The bottom right is the CEJST, or the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which comes out of the Justice 40 initiative, which, if you're not familiar, is an initiative from the Biden-Harris administration to direct 40% of federal resources to underserved or marginalized communities. And they base that on several different factors, but one of those is PM2.5. And so both of these tools are based on one particular data set that comes out of EPA, the CMAQ Fusion product, which is at a fairly coarse spatial resolution, 12 kilometers. And so there's been some newer data sets at a higher spatial resolution, including one out of Randall Martin's group here from WashU. And so we were curious what those data sets, if they agreed or disagreed, and what we could sort of learn in terms of environmental justice impacts. Awesome. So in this study, we focused on 2019. We took 3 different data sets. So this CMAQ Model Monitor Fusion product that many of you might be familiar with, which is at this coarser spatial resolution, and then 2 others. We averaged them all to the census tract to allow for an apples to apples comparison. Just to direct you, the table on the left is showing those different spatial resolutions. So the Van Donkler data set, this is the WashU one, is at about 1 kilometer spatially, whereas this Amini data set uses machine learning and a whole suite of observations to give 50-meter resolution in urban areas, 1 kilometer in rural regions. And then these 2 higher spatial resolution data sets rely upon a whole suite of satellite observations. The plots on the right are just a snapshot of 3 of the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the US that we looked at. There's a lot more detail on these slides than I'll be able to go into, but happy to take more questions. Basically, some of the biggest takeaways, so that CMAQ-F or CMAQ Fusion product shows a lot more sort of spread out or diffuse high PM2.5 concentrations given the coarser spatial resolution, whereas the 2 higher resolution data products, you're able to resolve these high concentrations, for example, along these black lines, which are major highways. And we can also then look and sort of correlate some of these high concentrations with areas of higher people of color. And that's what the far right panel is showing. So for the sake of time, I'm going to try and go to the next slide. Great. And so what we did here is we looked at population extremes, so the exposure for the most and least of non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic populations. So looking at the 10th and 90th percentiles of people and the associated concentrations. And there's a lot going on these slides, but the big takeaway is that these different data sets are the different shapes. And what we can see is that actually across regions, urban, rural areas, that there's general agreement in terms of who is most or least exposed. And as we would expect from the literature, that that people of color are more exposed to higher concentrations. What we did in this next plot is we showed that there's also regional consistency for population weighted averages. And so what we're now showing are relative disparities. If that number is closer to 1, that means that the population subgroup is exposed to the average in that region. If it's above, that means that the population subgroup is more exposed. And so what you can see from this plot is that non-Hispanic Blacks in light blue, non-Hispanic Asians in orange tend to be more exposed, as we know from the literature, than other groups. And what's also heartening to see is that these 3 different data sets shown with the different shapes tend to agree at the regional scale. What we then looked at, though, is if this holds for interurban or at the city scale, and we saw a lot more inconsistencies. There are smaller differences, so it's harder to maybe see in this plot, but there's a lot more disagreement. Phoenix is the only city in those top 10 largest metropolitan areas where we see agreement across the different data sets. And then for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to our last plot. I mentioned before that Justice 40 initiative, which is using that CMAQ fusion product, in addition with a poverty metric to identify disadvantaged areas based on air pollution. And so what this plot is showing is if we use the different data sets we looked at, what that actually looks like across the US. And so in black, that's where all 3 data sets agree that this census tract is disadvantaged. In orange is if the 2 higher resolution data sets suggest it is, but the CMAQ fusion product does not. And then blue is where only the CMAQ fusion product identifies a census tract. And so we also blew up some of those 10 largest cities to show you the sort of differences we're seeing spatially. For example, Los Angeles, there's a lot more agreement across the data sets, whereas in some of these other cities like Chicago, the south side of Chicago is coming up mostly in blue, suggesting only that CMAQ fusion product is showing disadvantaged tracts. I'm out of time, so I'll just very briefly say some numbers to sort of leave you with. But about 4.5 million people are identified as disadvantaged in all 3 data sets, whereas an additional 1.5 million are identified by the 2 higher resolution data sets, but not that coarser one used by EPA and others. And then there's another roughly 3 million people identified as disadvantaged in the coarse data set, but not in these higher resolution ones. And so just to conclude that there needs to be sort of more thought put into which data set people are using to think about environmental justice implications. So thank you.
So I'll just ask you to hold on to your questions. We're going to do them at the end of all the talks. So our next speaker is Tracey Holloway from University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thank you, Qian. It's really nice to be talking here about some of our work on environmental justice. Thank you, Jenny, for navigating all the
As it goes black.
yeah, for the AV. If you could pull up my next slide. I just want to start with this idea that, you know, a lot of our work in environmental justice has been evolving organically through our activities on HAQAST, especially the Environmental Justice Tiger team led by Susan Annenberg and Qian, as well as related projects funded by the Joyce Foundation and the McKnight Foundation, who serve the Upper Midwest. And just like HAQAST is really trying to be a bridge to connect NASA data products with user needs, our work funded by these 2 foundations is trying to support our connecting advanced science with the needs of environmental nonprofits in the Upper Midwest. And through this process, we started working with Fresh Energy, which is a nonprofit for clean energy based in Minneapolis. And Ben Passer at Fresh Energy asked if we could use the INMAT model. And I will say that at the time, I'm embarrassed to confess, I had not heard of the INMAT model. But the more I began looking at it, I realized that it is the only model that allows for within cities analysis of different energy scenarios with an eye toward environmental justice. So we began using INMAP on a project in Madison, Wisconsin, funded by Madison Gas and Electric, and reached out to Chris Tessum, who joined a project where we were looking at different sources of PM 2.5 and responses to clean energy policies in Madison. But through that process, we also saw that due to biases in the INMAP model, it was overestimating the amount of agriculture contributing to PM 2.5 and underestimating the amount of point sources and power plants contributing to PM 2.5. Thank you. Through this process, we were thinking about how can we use the capabilities of INMAP, which are very powerful, but harness them better to existing data. So for our study over Madison, we used ground-based speciated monitors to adjust the output of INMAP, which is feasible because it's a linear additive model, so you can adjust the different components individually. But as we were thinking about how to extend that on a national scale, we realized that we should take advantage of some of the spatially continuous data products, especially from Randall Martin and Aaron von Donkelaar, who provide a satellite-derived speciated PM 2.5 data set. And following that, actually, Chris and I have a NASA grant focused on environmental justice, where we work to integrate INMAP and satellite-derived data products. So just to sort of give you an idea of how this all came together, the good news is that INMAP captures these small spatial scales that are essential for environmental justice. And just here you see over Houston, INMAP sulfate PM 2.5 patterns, and they vary at scales that are essential for looking at the heterogeneity of populations within a city. And in this case, it's Houston, but we could do this map for any city in the United States. But if you compare that with the satellite-derived data from Randall and Aaron, you see that actually INMAP is much too low for sulfate. And we really view this as the best available spatially continuous data set because it's taking an advanced model, the GeoSchem model, and advanced data from satellites and ground-based measurements. So it's as close to truth as we can get, but it doesn't allow us to do those interventions and the if-then things that INMAP does. So we're trying to take the best of both worlds and harness them together. What we did is scaled INMAP species by species, at least for ammonia and sulfate, which were the ones that had the two biggest problems, and provide this scaled, kind of improved version of INMAP. And as a result of this, just to look at these two issues that were the flags of the problem to begin with, the unscaled INMAP has much larger contributions of agriculture, that's panel A, versus the scaled, what we call SENMAP, satellite-enabled INMAP, has much lower contributions of agriculture. And like electricity is much lower in the unscaled INMAP and much higher in the scaled INMAP. So we think this is moving this widely used tool closer to reality, and it's fundamentally changing the impacts of how different energy and sectors contribute to environmental justice and air quality. We used this model, which then goes down to the 1 by 1 kilometer scale, to then conduct equity analyses in 100 cities across the United States, sector by sector, looking at transportation, power plants, industry, non-point sources, and agriculture. And qualitatively consistent with past studies using INMAP for this kind of equity analysis and other studies that have been published, the Black populations are disproportionately exposed to nearly every source, and white populations are disproportionately underexposed to most sources, but it really varies sector by sector. And so what we've been doing now is to take the capabilities of this satellite-enabled INMAP model and trying to make them useful to stakeholder communities. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Langston and Verdin. We've also worked with other stakeholders across the US. And because INMAP is a national scale model, like we have the data and tools ready to go for any city who would like to do this kind of analysis. And this is a shout out to my student Lizzie Kaisella's poster. She'll be presenting this afternoon. But with this data, we can provide PM concentrations on the neighborhood scale. Here it's shown over Milwaukee. We can conduct an equity analysis for an individual city. We can calculate mortality and other health outcomes, and we can do a source contribution assessment, which really is eye-opening for each city about how different sources contribute to annual PM2.5. So if you are in a region or city who would like this analysis, just reach out to us, and we have funding and we're ready to go to help. We've also been taking some similarities, not necessarily using InMap, but to work on other issues. And I just want to use the last minute or two of my time here to mention some of the other work we're doing with HAQAST funding and that Randall is being presented here. We are also working with Randall and Aaron on a project with the American Lung Association. In that case, there are monitors that are used for the American Lung Association State of the Air report, but 2/3 of US counties don't have a single monitor. And so one thing that the American Lung Association does is rank counties from dirtiest to cleanest, but in counties that are missing a monitor, it's impossible to rank them. So what we've done is to take other data products from the WashU group, not the same one that we were talking about before, but analyzing them relative to the design values that the American Lung Association uses, and to rank counties from dirtiest, that's number 1. You don't want to be number 1 in this ranking, all the way down to the cleanest counties, the 3,000. And so for the first time, we have a spatial mapping of all counties and their relative rank in a manner comparable to what the ALA is already doing. Some other work that we're doing with NASA, thank you, Lizzie, is responding to inquiries that we get. And I gave a talk at a meeting about 6 months ago to air quality managers across California from the Air Management District. And as a follow-up, we were asked by Oceano Dunes, by San Luis Obispo, if satellites would be able to see a dust plume coming off of a vehicle recreation area on the beaches at Oceano Dunes. And actually, we weren't sure because it's a 6-mile beach, but nobody had ever looked at a dust plume from such a small source before. And so this is work that Jennifer McGinnis, my student, will be presenting at the poster session. But we can see a clear signature of the plume, which it's not some magic bullet, but it helps to show from different perspectives the story and how the emissions from the beach is affecting nearby communities for PM10. I mentioned earlier the user forum, and I think this is I wanted to say kind of slightly, I updated this talk like 3 times. Thank you. And one slide that did not make it into this version is my student, Alicia Hoffman, who's also presenting a poster this afternoon on some of the work we're doing to update chemistry in CMAQ. Because as we're using simple models, we also want to make sure that the advanced models are moving forward and using the best available science to support air quality management. So I'd like to end with another shout out to our user forum. We're really hoping that coming out of this meeting, we get some traction and feedback on what's working and what's not. But we also think this kind of forum is essential for reaching to support environmental justice engagement, because there's such a wide variety of organizations with a wide variety of background and questions. We wanted to have a welcoming, open space for interested community groups of any type to connect with data tools and capabilities of HAQAST. So with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracey. So our next speaker, I think, is Libby Mohr. He's here. So I will just hand it to you.
Thank you. My name is Libby Mohr. I'm a data analyst at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm excited and humbled to be speaking in this session. My talk today will be broken into sort of 2 parts. I'll spend most of the time talking about an application of satellite data that we have recently been exploring. And then in the last few minutes, I'll touch on a couple of other projects that are happening in other parts of EDF. So I'll start by diving into our interest in detecting startup, shutdown, and malfunction emissions with satellite data. And this work is a small piece of EDF's petrochemicals initiative. And our petrochemicals initiative was really born out of this acknowledgement that while petrochemicals are really baked into our daily lives, their production comes with costs, and these costs include emissions of hazardous air pollutants that impact nearby communities. So our goal with this initiative is to improve the health and well-being of communities that are overburdened by toxic emissions from petrochemical production. As part of this initiative, we've been scoping collaborations with environmental justice communities, including Port Arthur, Texas. And Port Arthur is it's situated on the Gulf Coast in the southeast corner of Texas, shown by the yellow star there. And Port Arthur has really been burdened by industrial pollution for decades. So the map on the right shows reported emissions of hazardous air pollutants to EPA's toxic release inventory, and you can see that there are several facilities in the area that are impacting the community. If we look at the distribution of cancer risk from air toxics exposure across all census tracts in the US, and we sort of map Port Arthur onto this distribution, we find that Port Arthur is in the 98th percentile for cancer risk from air toxics exposure. And I'll note that even the absolute numbers that you see on the x-axis are likely to be underestimates for reasons I won't get into. And so one of the community groups that we have started having discussions with is particularly interested in not just sort of the routine emissions that occur when plants are operating normally, but also these sort of upset emissions that occur during periods when facilities are starting up, shutting down, or malfunctioning. And I'll refer to these as SSM emissions. These SSM emissions are often granted exemption from regulation, especially in Texas. And so there's really a concern among community members that these SSM emissions allow facilities to emit more than they're legally permitted to. These SSM emissions are not uncommon, and they can account for actually a significant portion of the total emissions for a given facility. And they range in magnitude. So one example of an SSM event might be that the operators decide to flare a chemical in response to a power outage. But an SSM event could also look more like this. This was an explosion at a plant in the Port Arthur region that happened in November 2019. It set off a series of fires that lasted for weeks following the explosion. And so the state of Texas is actually pretty unique in that it requires facilities to report SSM emissions that pass a certain threshold within 24 hours of the event starting. And so this example that I'm showing here is taken from a database of these reports. And in this example, the SSM event resulted from restarting a specific unit of the facility following Winter Storm Elliott. It lasted about 6 days, and you can see that there were multiple different chemicals released. So we had this idea. We thought we can see volcanic eruptions and we can see wildfires from space. So can we see these SSM events from space? And if so, sort of what can we learn about where they're happening, how often they're happening, and how big they are? And so we figured if there was any chance that we were going to see SSM emissions from space, we thought that we would probably be able to see this one. This, as I mentioned, was an explosion that at a 1,3-butadiene producing facility in Port Arthur that lasted, set off a series of fires that lasted for about a month. And so, oh, sorry, I'll go back. I just wanted to say that the emissions report for this event included releases of VOCs, NOx, and SO2. And so we decided to look at formaldehyde, NO2, and SO2 satellite imagery to see if there was any evidence that this event had occurred. And before I show the results, I know I already gave a sneak peek. I just want to note that we are in the very early stages of this work, and so these results are very preliminary. So let's start with formaldehyde, and just to orient you, I visualized the data within the orange box on the left. The location of the explosion is shown with a yellow star. And the images on the right show Tracey data that we oversampled to 1 kilometer resolution for the week before the explosion and the week after the explosion. And so if we look at the area sort of surrounding the yellow star,
you can kind of see that formaldehyde may be increased following the explosion compared to the week before, but I would argue that it's not really entirely clear that this was a result of the explosion, and that we'd really need to account for things like other sources and chemical transformations and wind direction before we could really draw any firm conclusions from this. So let's look at NO2. What we find here is that NO2 appears to be higher actually the week before the explosion, with particularly high readings down in that sort of southern area. And interestingly, if we look at the SSM report database for that week, we find that there was a report from the facility that was located in the dark purple area. And finally, the story for SO2 is kind of similar to formaldehyde, where the area to the east of the explosion appears to be slightly elevated, maybe following the explosion, but it's really hard to draw conclusions without using a more detailed model. So we also took a different approach where instead of starting with a known event and looking in the satellite data, we looked for anomalies in the satellite data and then checked the SSM event database to see if there was an emissions report. And so what we did is we drew a 2-kilometer buffer around a specific facility shown as a translucent white circle on the left. And we calculated the average NO2 column density for every week in 2022. We wanted to account for background NO2. So as a sort of convenient and really crude, admittedly, initial attempt, we subtracted average NO2 column density for the same week from a 2-kilometer area just off of the coast where we thought there might be less human influence. And so this plot shows the resulting time series. And what you notice is there's four pretty clear spikes. When we compared the timing of these spikes with SSM emission reports, we found that 3 out of 4 of them actually coincided with upset emission reports from the facility. And so overall, we're seeing some consistencies between the emission event report and the satellite data, but we're really just starting this work and we're interested to hear your feedback and ideas. So now I'll sort of jump into additional updates from EDF. And the first project I want to share is EDF's Climate Vulnerability Index, which is sort of similar to the tools that Tess shared. It's basically a screening tool, which is a way of quantifying vulnerability to climate change in different areas of the US. It includes 184 different indicators, all derived from publicly available data. And I did want to note that multiple indicators in this CVI tool use satellite-derived data that was provided by the HAQAST Satellite Data for Environmental Justice Tiger Team. So thank you to the Tiger Team. And if you're interested in learning more about the CVI, I'd encourage you to check out a recent paper that was published earlier this year, and also keep an eye out for a dashboard that will go live in September. Last but not least, my colleagues at EDF have been collaborating with Susan Annenberg and Gage Kerr at George Washington University to really visualize the localized impacts of transportation-related air pollution on pediatric asthma in several US cities. And EDF has been using these maps to support our clean transportation advocacy. And we've also shared these health impact maps with a number of environmental justice groups, in addition to collaborating with local advocates in the South Bronx to develop communication materials based on these maps that help them advance their local advocacy objectives. And with that, I would like to thank everybody who has contributed to this work, both my EDF colleagues and external partners, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Ufuoma Ovienmhada. I'm sorry, I'm sure I didn't say it right. From MIT. So she is.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ufuoma. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at MIT, and I'm presenting preliminary results on satellite data for environmental justice, a scoping review, which is the work of about 12 authors, some of which are in this room, and this work would have been possible without them. So yeah, just to begin, we're all here because environmental justice is a really pressing issue. And we also know that some of the current ways of monitoring can be limited by sparse ground monitors, as well as coarse spatial resolution. So we wanted to explore existing literature at the intersection of satellite data for environmental justice around 3 key points. The first, to explore trends in study types, topics, geographic scope, and the data sets used to conduct research in environmental justice. Second, to synthesize findings from studies that use satellite data to characterize population disparities. And third, to capture how satellite data is relevant to policy and real-world impact. So I'll quickly summarize the methodology and just say that we are using the guidelines from PRISMA for conducting a scoping review. The main thing I'll highlight here is that the inclusion criteria for our review required that studies were US-based, published between 2000 and 2022, and used satellite data as an independent variable to report on disproportionate exposures or vulnerability across demographic or socioeconomic categories. And so that led to 73 articles to be included in our review. To break down the different topics, so we found 38 studies in air pollution, 15 in green space, 16 in temperature, and 4 in other impact, which included things such as nightlight pollution, natural gas flaring, floods, and mountaintop removal mining. So the overall synthesis across the studies is that the majority of 73 articles showed evidence of unequal exposure of vulnerability to environmental burdens, including air pollution, heat, and other impacts, and unequal access to environmental benefits such as green space along lines of race, income, ethnicity, and other markers. This is, in alignment with a lot of previous environmental justice literature, but this is specifically using satellite data to show that evidence. Most studies concluded that non-white and low-income populations had the largest disparities in exposures and the highest vulnerabilities to a range of health effects. This includes things such as cancers, higher infections of COVID-19, mortality, hospitalizations, et cetera. In the next few slides, I'll summarize some of the trends and insights that we pulled out from looking at these 73 articles. So first is around the topics that are analyzed. So generally, air pollution is overrepresented, which is a great thing, I guess, for this group of people. But we really want to see more studies into the other areas, green space, temperature, and those other impacts. The next trend that I want to pull out is the study type. So we characterize studies as either being cross-sectional, looking at only one point in time, or longitudinal, looking at multiple points in time. And it's a near even split. And what this shows to me is more studies could really leverage the temporal archive of satellite data to do multi-temporal studies. This is important to consider because cumulative exposures can help us to understand how vulnerability for certain groups is changing over time or reducing. We also can look at geographic scope. So this is referring to the level of analysis a study was conducted at, whether it was a city level, county, state, national, et cetera. And what we're seeing is over time, more studies are being conducted at that national level. So that's really leveraging that spatial coverage advantage of satellite data. And we saw less and less single city analyses. We can also look at what areas are most represented in the study. So this map is showing studies that are not at the national level, so state level or below, and which ones are or are not represented. What we can see here is that the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest have not really had state or sub-state level studies, which is important to consider, especially Pacific Northwest wildfires. The Midwest has also, faced a range of environmental justice issues, and even Missouri is not represented in this map. Another trend I want to pull out is the types of satellite data sources used. So satellites can generally be classified as being passive or active, where the vast majority of satellites are passive satellites. However, active sensors such as synthetic aperture radar are important to consider, as active sensors offer expansive capabilities such as being able to see at night, see through clouds, and can be applied to things such as forest monitoring, floods, oil spills, et cetera, subsidence, all topics that definitely have intersections with environmental justice. So that's something that future work could, try to tap into those types of applications and uses of sensors. Lastly, I'll summarize some strengths and limitations that we're seeing of satellite data. And I'll breeze through this and also plug that this work is also being presented by colleagues in the poster session later. So if you want to delve more into this and the specific examples of literature that show these strengths, you can check that out. But satellite data has positive implications for both public health agency and policy. It supports targeted interventions. We saw that in the literature. Can especially help to distinguish between disparities in urban versus rural areas, enables links to granular health data. Of course, the temporal archive, as I mentioned. We also saw, I think, 11 studies that simultaneously evaluated multiple environmental justice topics at the same time. Which is a capability that's really an advantage of satellite data. Some limitations, though, of course, is that several things that are relevant to environmental justice, such as certain air pollutants, are undetectable by satellite data. There might be gaps due to cloud smoke, et cetera. And also temperature and air pollution measurements from satellite data can vary from the surface level measurements. So care must be taken into how those measurements are being used. I'll end there, and thank you to the big team of folks, again, without which this work would not be possible. And yeah, really grateful. Thanks.
Thank you, Ufuoma.
So our last speaker is Langston Verdin from the MKE FreshAir Collective. All right.
Thank you, thank you. And shout out to Jenny, you have been holding it down with these slides here. I would be freaked out the whole time. So thank you everyone for allowing me to have the opportunity to share some of the lessons learned over the last 3 years of doing neighborhood level air quality monitoring in the Milwaukee area. So just a little bit about MKE FreshAir Collective. We are a group of folks who are passionate about the environment, passionate about climate, and just about our community in the Milwaukee area. These are all folks that either I am related to, you might be able to tell from the picture here, or I have just gotten to know through social media, through using networks along the way. And these are folks who are all hosting air monitors either at their place of business or at their homes right now. So just really quickly, I wanted to highlight some of the successes over the last 3 years. So currently we have 8 air monitors that are placed in the Milwaukee area, predominantly in Black and brown communities in Milwaukee. Our monitors have over 6,000 followers, something we're super excited about and love to share. We've been collecting data for about 3 years on at least 2 of the air monitors, and the others we've been collecting for maybe the last 6 or 8 months. So we're hoping to get some more data from those. I've done roughly 20 presentations for community groups, schools, and childcare centers regarding air quality. But for me, most importantly, linking them up to the air monitors so that they know the quality of the air and what to do about it in real time. And lastly, we're 100% volunteer. So none of us are being paid to do this work. It's like a passion project, a love project for us. So excited about that as well. Lost my ability to click. Fantastic, thank you. So a handful of lessons learned is kind of what I'm going to share with you all. These are all things that I wish somebody would have told me 3 years ago, but I'm happy to be able to share it with you all. So on each one of these slides, you'll see a little bit of information about the neighborhood in which this particular air monitor is placed, some of the racial demographics and age range. This was important because this project started in response to seeing some disparities related to asthma ED utilization in the Milwaukee area, particularly in Black and brown communities, particularly among young folks. So I skipped ahead. So one of the things that I learned is that backyards can be really tricky in terms of placing air monitors. Any ideas why? Yeah. Barbecues, absolutely. Other, yes.
Roads tend to face the front of the houses, not the back.
What's that? Since Space Park?
Roads. tend to face the
Roads,
front,
yes,
yeah.
yes. Go ahead.
Smoking.
Smoking, yes. Others? Kids. What would the kids do?
Balls, basketball, soccer.
Knock down your air monitor, absolutely, yeah.
Laundry machine.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so all of these things are true, right? Grills, fire pits, vehicle exhaust. Just learned on one of our most recent air monitors that we place around dryer vents. We hadn't placed one close enough to a dryer vent to have this problem. But I kept finding that the air quality was just getting really bad. And so we're trying to find out why. And it was within about 8 feet of a dryer vent is where it was originally placed. Put it 20 feet up in the air, thought that would be the solution. It just went right up all the way. But what we did learn is that air doesn't turn a corner. So we put it on the other side of the building up 20 feet and didn't have that issue anymore. So really tricky, something to be on the lookout for. I did not think about the kids though, for this one in particular. That hadn't been a problem. But here it has been a problem. So again, I told you that this was a project that was in response to some utilization data among kids. So we wanted to work with schools and childcare centers to place these air monitors. What I learned is that having a champion, having a sponsor in those settings is critical. Somebody that can go to bat for you, somebody that can argue your point to the principal, to the IT folks that we need this. Place them out of reach of little hands. Our very first air monitor, actually it was our second, we placed at a childcare center. They wouldn't let us post it on the wall for whatever reason. We put it on a desk. It was out by the playground, like the tot lot area. We thought it was great. I mean, I had to go there every other day to plug it back in because the little hands would get to it, right? So lesson learned there. One of our other sensors, this one you see here, is in the Muskego Way neighborhood, heavily Hispanic neighborhood in Milwaukee. Thank you. We found a really fantastic location right by their playground, but kind of off around the corner. It was also maybe about 10, 15 feet from a busy street. So we're like, this is great. We're going to learn a lot here. Also highly visible, right? It creates a lot of curiosity about what is this thing? And we didn't put any special, security blocking mechanisms on here to keep it on the wall, right? And within a few months of placing, it was gone. Which was such a headache because we got it placed with Milwaukee Public Schools, which is our predominant school system. They allowed us, after about 6 months of negotiation, to place it on their network. And so, yeah, that was a whole nother story of issues. We also learned that Wi-Fi can be tricky at schools because of these really old, well-built buildings. And we found a perfect spot and the outlet didn't work. And so we had to wait a few months for them to fix the outlet, and all those things just add time. More specific to the pandemic than I think anything, there was a lot of turnover. So we'd have a champion at a school, at a childcare center, and I just stopped getting emails from them. Well, they left, right? They're no longer there. So it was constant, this cycle of rebuilding relationships with these organizations and having the same conversations over and over again. And not only that, once we found the right person, well, now the IT department guy left. And so now we got to go through a new challenge there. So that was huge and frankly continues to be a challenge. I've had to get really good at leveraging social media and those networks to find success here, not being shy to ask for help with folks. Also, I mean, when I was at the last HAQAST meeting, networking with the folks that were in this room to say, hey, let's talk about some opportunities here. We're really good at collecting the data. I know how to, do some of the data analysis. I just don't like doing it. And there's a lot of folks in here that do. So where can we find those relationships to be able to take this on? The other benefit is folks really want to talk about air quality. If, throughout the pandemic, we learned that our air quality and the air we're breathing in and out is really important. And so I didn't have too many challenges getting in front of people, leaning into the air quality and equity momentum. Most importantly, I think it was, really easy for us to stray away from the mission, right? So we have been very equity focused, very justice driven. I've gotten requests for air monitors in communities that were outside of our target areas. Resources are limited, so we've been having to be really specific about where we focus our efforts, but ultimately, we want to be able to understand the air in these communities and how it impacts health outcomes. Been working to create new partnerships, as I talked about, and leveraging our existing partnership with schools, childcare centers, healthcare as well. Lastly, I put ChatGPT is dope. There's a lot of folks who get really scared of AI and the potential, is it going to take over? Maybe, frankly, as what I've learned at navigating this. But it's really been helpful for me as kind of being the one-man show leading a lot of this work with the support of the collective, putting content together for the website, for social media, for emails to potential partners that, of course, we review and proof and all of that stuff. That stuff takes a lot of time, right? And so having a resource like this that can pull that together for us, and then us to be able to utilize to move the mission forward has been super duper helpful. That being said, what's next? I was recently in DC doing some lobbying regarding air quality with APHA. We want to be able to leverage our data and our networks to advocate for policy change in the Milwaukee area. I am a huge proponent of let the data lead the way. If this data says that, the air quality isn't the cause of these poor asthma health outcomes, then we move on. Something else is going on. Let's navigate that as well. But that's where we're going to be moving next. Lastly, please check out the website. Take a picture, scan that for me, provide your feedback. I'd love it. We launched it maybe a month ago. A lot of the content was ChatGPT created and then tweaked by our team and some feedback from others. But even with a lot of these AI things, you have to tell it what to do, right? And so we're trying to be really intentional about including equity and justice in all of this work. So that's my time. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you to stay here and ask the other speakers to come up. So we will start our Q&A session. And I see we have some questions from online folks. So I guess I'll alternate between this room and the online participants, so we get everyone a chance to ask their questions. Let me start with this room. So anyone to start? Yes.
I have a question for Tess. So still curious about the blue points in last slide. So I'm still curious about the blue points in last slide that is identified by low resolution data set, which is hard to digest for me. So what's causing this high resolution data set missing this widespread locations? And does that imply any insight about disadvantages of this high resolution estimates? Thank you.
Good question. You want me to use the mic? Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess a few things to say to that. We didn't necessarily look into why these different data sets are the way they are, but they have a lot of different data inputs. One thing I didn't mention, so this is a good opportunity, is that the Amini data set is speciated, which means it has black carbon, organic carbon, all those sorts of pieces of PM2.5 simulated differently, but it doesn't include dust or sea salt. They haven't gotten there yet. So like in Phoenix, I don't know if you remember that plot, but it basically shows a really high hotspot just over downtown. And so we're expecting that's because it's not including dust. So it would be missing some of those other potentially high hotspots. So I guess I don't have a great answer for you, but I would say that a lot of the things we've talked about in this room are opportunities to answer those questions, like bringing in more satellite observations, bringing in machine learning, low-cost sensors, mobile monitoring to help us sort of identify what is happening. And then I'll also say we looked at a sort of average across the data sets to see what that might tell us. and it matches against observations. We compared against AQS monitors. It does pretty much just as well in terms of like the R squared and that sort of thing. And so we mentioned this paper is in review that it would be helpful to have sort of more model intercomparison projects. Like that's done a lot in the climate community, but maybe less in the air quality community. And that's another opportunity to answer these questions that you're asking.
There we go.
Sure, yeah, we have a question from Aaron Senyoka. For Langston, what small sensors is your team using, and have there been any standout issues with their data quality aside from the issue with the backyards?
Thank you for that. So we use IQ Air's outdoor air monitors for this project. I get that question all the time. What air monitors you use, and why did you choose IQ Air, and why not this one? Well, they were the ones who partnered with us. They provided free air monitors to us. Continue to do that. Shout out to my partners at IQ Air here today. If others, Purple Air would have been so amenable, we'd be using Purple Air right now, and that's what it comes down to. I trust in the data that I'm getting from the air monitor. I'm not someone who could an engineer who can understand how and why these aren't working. But what I do know is when our air monitors are alerting that something's wrong, I look at it, right? I get that notification on my app and I look at it and I try to figure out what's going on. And that's where, I realized that the air from the air vent, from the dryer vent was impacting it. By and large, the air monitors that we host stay pretty consistent with the regulated air monitors monitor in our area. Off by a little bit up or down, right? So I'm not too concerned about that. What it does do, and what I get excited about, is when we have pockets of poor air quality. We had one of the air monitors was off the chart for the air quality index. It was like 168. And I'm like, okay, everywhere else in the community is like a 38. What is happening here? So I text my brother. This one is on his house. I'm like, what's going on in your neighborhood, right? One of his neighbors 4 houses down was burning garbage in the backyard, right? And his whole neighborhood was just full of soot, right? And so while the rest of our monitors, they're showing us fantastic air quality, it's not impacting them, right? They don't need that type of notification for neighborhood level incident. The folks who are following that air monitor got that notification. And so that part excites me less than the technical side of, is it within this many degrees? I'll let the scientists work on that. I tend to focus in on how is this impacting the consumer, the neighbor resident experience.
Anyone in the room?
Yeah, it's kind of a question for my colleague on how Earth observations are being used, or if they're being used to affect the social vulnerability index or incorporated into it in any way, shape, or form.
I think the question about the climate vulnerability index.
I think that's a separate index. So I guess this question relates to kind of using the SVI and yeah, I guess you can answer it in the context of the climate vulnerability index. This is also like an international context as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think the 3 layers, I might be wrong about this. I think there's satellite data was used to get average NO2 concentrations and PM2.5 concentrations at the census tract level. There's one other one that I'm forgetting, but there's 3 different satellite data products that were used to get those concentrations at the census tract level. And so they're at the same scale as all of the other layers, and they can sort of be integrated into the tool that way. I am not an expert on this, so I'd be happy to connect you with my colleague who has sort of put her heart and soul into this project, if you have more questions.
We also have another project outside of HAQAST in the health and air quality portfolio with Dr. Julia Golke at Virginia Tech that is the partners of social vulnerability index.
Do we have more questions from the chat?
No, but I have a question for me.
Oh, all right.
Okay, this came from actually our survey from last year. Our meeting in October, we also had a panel on environmental justice and some of you were on. So someone was speaking from the perspective as a person of color who grew up in a community with very polluted air, and they were asking about, how can these people from these communities trust groups of white people where they feel like they're just being studied as subjects for the benefit of their career advancement. And so thinking of that context of structural racism and where positionality and privilege, to sort of how do we build those relationships where we acknowledge these issues that have caused the environmental injustice and everything else, while understanding people are coming from different backgrounds. So I'd just be curious for your perspectives on how you've worked with people on that.
All right, who want to go first? Guess it's for the entire.
Yeah, this is probably not going to be a direct answer at all, but one of the things that the authors for the review paper are really interested in is like, is this work being done with communities? Is this work actually leading to impact? Or are people just, publishing papers about disparities and ending there? And overwhelmingly, we didn't find any examples from a body of literature, at least discussed in the paper, of the disparities being studied in conjunction with the community to work on how the satellite data could then be used to target interventions and different mitigation strategies. And for me, that's like a really big oversight of this area of research, and something that we hope to advocate for and push for as a result, of this synthesis. Big supporter of participatory action research, community engaged research, and personally, I think a lot more research needs to start from that point of working with communities, because it's not just, oh, you do the science and then let's figure out the impact, but working with communities from the start can improve the science, can improve what questions you're asking in the first place.
I love that you led with that, because I will follow with the now what. One of the things that drives me nuts about academia is a lot of research, and then it gets published, and then you all will move on to the next research topic, right? It may be related, or we found out this one thing, let's explore this a little more. For the community you're researching, it's now what? And so I think however you can build the now what into your research, maybe that's funding an organization that can then respond to what we find in the research. Build that in on the front end so that the community that is being observed, being researched, can see you actually engaged in the work to fix the now what, right? I think that's going to be really important, because not only is your organization trying to understand and researching this community, but others are too, right? And so I think when the community can see you as a part of the fix, as a part of improving things versus studying things, it goes a long way to build those relationships.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think Environmental Defense Fund is obviously is a big green organization, and there's historically been this sort of pattern of the big greens, swooping in and helicoptering in to these communities, and sort of without their input. And I think at EDF we're trying to change that model and work towards more of a co-creation approach. I know it's kind of a buzzword, but we're engaging with the community before we've even decided what our scientific questions are. And I think that's sort of where we need to start, not coming in with a question and then engaging the community, but really sort of having a back and forth conversation. And it certainly, it takes longer. One of my colleagues always says that our work moves at the speed of trust. And so it's totally valid for these communities to be distrustful of an environmental organization like us. And so we're working really hard to sort of try to rebuild that trust with this community co-creation process.
Thank you for that question. I think it's incredibly important. And I know Susan and I and others on the project I was speaking about have tried to talk about this quite a bit. We don't have a great answer. I guess I would say the motivation for the project we were working on is trying to push EPA and other federal agencies and groups to think more about this. And so we did speak with EPA before I, started running anything in R, and we've tried to sort of continue those conversations to push at the federal level to think more sort of thoughtfully about the data inputs that are being used in these conversations and with other partners.
Yeah, maybe I'll just sort of build on one last thing before we take the next question, which is that I think actually one of the issues is that we need more funding that allows for and requires community-based engagement and doesn't necessarily, and has the flexibility for that to be evolving. Because I think, if you have a solicitation and someone has 1 month to put together a proposal, then it's hard to build those trusting, real partnerships. And I think one thing that's been really valuable about the HAQAST initiative, so shout out to NASA, is that they've built this that has enough flexibility that we can be building these partnerships and hosting meetings and doing the kind of things that hopefully can lay the groundwork for sustained engagement, hopefully long after this particular grant cycle ends.
Question from you there.
Oh, is it someone?
There are a couple of them. That's,
Oh.
yeah, maybe you want. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. I'm from NYU City House Dashboard. So our team is trying to connect with like small cities, especially small city governments without a good data capacity. But one thing we did find is that the air pollution matrices on our website is kind of underutilized because a lot of the small city governments, especially the governments that doesn't have a good data capacity to interpret those data, tend to not to know like what to do with those data. So like, for example, we also have things like limited access to healthy food on our dashboard. So those data are more utilized because like they can just put a like mobile food truck somewhere in the underserved areas. So I was wondering, like with those, like we're talking about a lot of like environmental justice and trying to reach out to communities, that we also want to like try to build a communication package for those small city governments, like what kind of things like those people can do. So I was wondering if there are any like resources you would like to share, or there's anything that we can communicate. Like we have some direct channels with those small city governments. So if there's anything that we can communicate directly for them, like to teach them how to utilize those data and how to interpret those data, and something that can be done as a city government, but without a like big data or planning capacities.
Communication is city government.
Well, I don't want to put Langston on the spot, but I know this is a topic that he'd been thinking about too, and had partnerships with the Milwaukee Public Schools and have been talking about action oriented. So now you're on the spot.
I was thinking about that too, and I used to work for city government. So, which is, that's a whole long story, but I think city government tends to get in its own way, just bureaucracy. And so that's part of the challenge that you're facing, I would imagine, in many cases is, capacity and whatnot, and how much time they have to invest in this type of project, under the assumption that, well, probably somebody else is doing it. So it's there, it's a placeholder on our website, but somebody else is probably doing this work. I think, and maybe this is not the most direct answer, but I think working with the local organizations that maybe are partnered with the city government, or requiring city government to partner with those local organizations to be a part of a project that you all are investing your resources in, might be an opportunity for them to connect with the community, because a lot of the communities we're talking about here, when you're talking about environmental justice, are not trusting of city government either, right? And so if you have an opportunity to push the hand of city government to partner with the trusted folks in the community, I think you'll get a little more traction.
All right.
Going along with what you said, I'm Chris Heimsoth with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources Air Quality Monitoring Group. And I think you're on the right path myself. I think it's education for like you're in the schools, it's education for those kids. You're in the communities, it's education for those community members. The person who wrote that email or the question, that person should get involved, should learn what these values mean. Why is that one spike? We don't want to panic when we see a spike. We want to understand why it's because someone was burning some trash next door. We also want to understand that because they're burning trash next door, we may want to stay inside and not go out, and it might cause us issues. To me, it's all education, and education takes time. It's not something that it's going to change overnight, and knee-jerk reactions oftentimes give you 2 steps back and 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So I think you're on the right path myself. I think the data that comes out, you just keep pushing that. You've got to work with the groups like Langston and talk with the community and get that education, get people educated on what they're seeing and get them to understand where they can talk about air quality with an understanding of what it means, what's going on. That's all I have.
Hi, yeah, this question connects with the question Jenny asked and partially answered by Tracey's response, but I wanted to attempt to build on it further in that you're all doing this great work in environmental justice, and it is really challenging to go from satellite remote sensing data all the way down towards identifying disparities and then progressing all the way on towards action. And I'm wondering how HAQAST can better support that endeavor, recognizing that many of us here are scientists. We do have a stakeholder community, but many of us are not necessarily trained to identify appropriate policy or to appropriately connect with communities. That's a challenging space for which there are experts that I can, for one, say I'm not. And I'm wondering what is the right way for that engagement to occur? It can be time consuming. It does require some skills that go beyond HAQAST. I'm thinking of something perhaps connecting more broadly with stakeholders that would have a specific interest or background in this space, but I feel like we need some guidance, and it's not obvious to me what the right way to do so to share that knowledge in an appropriate manner is. So I wanted to ask this.
Start. So I feel really lucky to work at EDF where we have a science team, but we also have a legal team and a community engagement team. And so we're all sort of working in the same space, but even so, it can be challenging to sort of bridge the gap between the scientists, the policy people, and the community engagement people. And what we find sometimes is that we will approach the legal team, for example, and say, well, what do you want to know? We have all this science, like ask us some questions. And the legal team will say, well, what can you tell us? And so it's sort of like this this chicken and egg problem. And so one thing we found to be helpful is just to actually step over the line a little bit and into the legal team space and maybe like read a regulation or proposed rule and see maybe where we can plug in. And we actually had done that recently, and it started this really fruitful collaboration with the legal team. And so sometimes it's just taking that first step and yeah, reading all of the legal jargon and figuring out how your science can help support policy change.
Yeah, I'll just build on that briefly. I think as scientists, we hate talking to people and networking sometimes. And I think maybe we need more of that to get at a lot of this sort of community engagement and co-creation of research questions. And I know being in Susan's group, it's been really interesting to see how research questions are maybe developed just by like a conversation with somebody at EDF or somebody elsewhere who's interested in a scientific question that our group has the expertise, the technical expertise to answer. And so maybe that's not like a formal RFP process. Maybe it's a contract or something that's like a little bit different than what scientists are used to doing. But I think that's led to the ability to answer some of these questions a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think partnership is just key. You know, there, as you said, like there are people who are experts in community engagement and semi-structured interviews, observation, and those things. So like early partnership as early as possible. Speaking to some of my own work in my dissertation, I'm in aerospace engineering. One of my mentors is a sociologist and really mentors me on the kind of more, social science aspects of the context that I'm working in. I'm also partnering with like a grassroots organization. And I think something that's important in this type of work that's kind of counter to academia sometimes is the willingness to be slow. You know, some folks, especially in academia, are probably familiar with like the IRB process that you need to do for like human subject research. And so one of the organizations I was partnered with, it was really important to them that they be part of the process of co-conducting interviews with me as opposed to just me. So I individually had IRB approval as early as November, but it was important to them. And so we had to go through that process, and that was just approved last month. So that added an additional 4 months to the process, but it was important, and that helps to build that trust. And especially because the organization has that close relationship to the communities we want to impact the most, it'll improve the science from start to finish.
I want to just, I love this path down there, down the panel. But you know, I guess the way that I think about it is very much the way that we do science in general. The same person who is building the satellite instrument is not necessarily the same person who's running the model. So sometimes some people span astrophysics to sociology, but everybody doesn't have to do that. And I think though, part of it is thinking about like, where is each of our contributions? And, you know, I think one example is the city of, the EPA had this solicitation for low-cost monitoring networks call recently. And the city of Madison reached out to my group because they knew that we'd done some work on Madison. And so we helped them think about like, what are the different pollutants that you could measure? Like, what are the different pros and cons of measuring carbon dioxide versus PM2.5? But then they took it and they brought in a lot of community groups in Madison. And really then the mayor's office is the one who's doing the community engagement, and we're there more as technical support. So I think just this idea, like everybody's role is a little different, but like figuring out like where is the best point of connection for the kind of work that each group is doing.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'll add is just make sure that whatever comes out of it is accessible and usable for the end user, right? So for the community. I'm so damn excited about Tempo and like what we can learn from that and what I may be able to utilize instead of, you know, community neighborhood air monitors, right? Like, can it tell me these things in places where we don't have air monitors? What I am not so excited about and not so optimistic about, and I'm hoping to be proven wrong, is the user interface that will come out of that. Because just I think historically, when you look at like government systems that are meant for the consumer, it's not really like, who'd you talk to? To say, let's design it this way. And so I'm really hopeful, at least, that the smart folks at NASA and within this room will consider the community experience in some of that data retrieval to make it super duper easy for people to understand their local air quality.
All right, I guess that's a great discussion to wrap this up. We are shall stay or maybe let's just wrap this up. But I'm sure our panelists are going to be here for a little bit longer. So if you have questions, you can ask. But let's give our panelists another round of applause. Thank you for participating.